April 1945, Camp Florence, Arizona. The desert doesn't forgive. It doesn't compromise. It simply exists, vast, indifferent, burning under a sun that turns the horizon into liquid mercury. For 23-year-old Greta Hoffman, stepping off that transport truck felt like stepping onto the surface of another planet. Her wrists still bore the rope marks. Not from cruelty. American soldiers had been almost apologetic when they tied her hands for transport. But rope leaves marks regardless of intent. Around her, 11 other German women climbed down, blinking against lights so sharp it felt like violence. Radio operators, clerks, one nurse, one telegraph specialist, none of them soldiers in the traditional sense, but all of them captured in the chaos of Europe's collapse, all of them certain they were walking toward death. Greta's grandmother had gripped her face in the Munich railway station 3 months earlier, fingers like talons digging into her cheeks. "They will starve you," the old woman had hissed. "They will beat you. They will parade you through streets so Americans can spit on you and throw stones. Don't let them break you. Die with honor." Greta had believed every word. But standing in that Arizona heat, watching a woman in a pressed U.S. Army uniform walk toward them with a clipboard instead of a rifle, the first crack appeared in everything she'd been taught. The woman stopped 3 paces away. Japanese-American, Greta realized with a jolt, dark hair pinned severely, expression neutral as carved stone. She spoke in flawless, formal German. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Tanaka. Welcome to Camp Florence. Follow me for processing. No shouting, no dogs, no hands raised to strike." Beside Greta, 19-year-old Anna Schultz whispered, "Where are the whips?" No one answered. They were all thinking it. But that evening, that first evening when the dinner bell rang and Greta held out her tin tray with shaking hands, everything her grandmother had taught her, everything the Reich had promised, everything she thought she knew about enemies and war and the savage Americans, all of it shattered on a single plate of food. A thick slab of beef roast, pink in the center. Mashed potatoes with butter melting into gold. Green beans, a roll that steamed when she touched it. Canned peaches glistening in heavy syrup. "This is American prison food," Greta whispered, and a voice behind her, cold, hard, full of certainty, said, "Don't touch it. It's poisoned." Before we dive into what happened next, if you want to hear more incredible untold stories that history tried to bury, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because what you're about to hear, it's going to change everything you thought you knew about war, about enemies, and about what it means to be human when the world tells you to be a monster. Liesl Weber materialized at Greta's elbow like a dark omen. 38 years old, former SS auxiliary, spine like an iron rod. She'd been barking orders since the transport, treating the other women like raw recruits who needed discipline to survive. She slapped the fork from Greta's hand. It clattered to the floor, obscenely loud in the sudden quiet. "It's poisoned," Liesl hissed in rapid German, her voice carrying that peculiar mix of conviction and paranoia that Greta had heard so often in the final months of the war. "They want us to think we're safe. They want us to eat like pigs before slaughter. This is theater. The real punishment comes later." She drew a finger across her throat. Sharp. Final. Around them, the other German women froze, trays in hand. The mess hall, filled with male German POWs who'd been here for months, watched with expressions ranging from pity to amusement. One older prisoner actually chuckled, shaking his head. But Liesl's logic made terrible sense. Of course it made sense. You didn't feed your enemies steak unless you were fattening them for something worse. That's what Greta had been taught. That's what every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every whispered warning had said. Americans were barbaric, vengeful. They would make Germans pay for every bomb, every bullet, every death. This food, This impossible, beautiful food had to be a trap. Then Lieutenant Sarah Tanaka sat down across from them. She didn't say anything at first, just set her own tray on the table, identical to theirs down to the last green bean, and cut into her beef with calm, methodical precision. She took a bite, chewed, swallowed, met Greta's eyes and said in that same level, formal German, Geneva Convention, Article 26, prisoners of war receive the same rations as the captor nation's troops. You can check the Red Cross report if you'd like. It's posted in the barracks. The world tilted. Let me pause the story here for a moment, because you need to understand something crucial about human belief systems. This isn't just about food. It's about the architecture of conviction, how we construct entire worldviews on foundations we never question, because everyone around us treats them as solid ground. Greta Hoffman had been 22 years old when the war ended. Born in 1923, she'd been 10 when Hitler came to power, 15 when the war started. She'd spent her entire adolescence and young adulthood inside a machine designed to shape reality itself. In school, they'd learned about American degeneracy, the mixing of races that weakened the blood, the capitalism that made humans into commodities, the crime-ridden cities where civilized life had collapsed into chaos. By the time Greta was 17, these weren't political opinions. They were facts, as solid and unquestionable as gravity. Her grandmother, who'd lived through World War I and the chaos that followed, had reinforced every lesson. They starved us with their blockades, the old woman would say, eyes distant with memory. Thousands of children died while Americans gorged themselves. They called it victory. They'll do worse this time. So when Greta looked at that steak, she wasn't just looking at food. She was looking at the complete collapse of a cosmology. If they lied about the food, what else was a lie? That night, long after lights out, Greta lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling. The barracks smelled of pine sap and dust and the soap they'd each been given. Real ivory soap, white and clean as a promise. In her pocket, wrapped in a handkerchief, was the piece of beef she'd saved. She'd hidden it in her sleeve when no one was looking, smuggled it back like contraband. Across the room, she could feel Liesel's presence in the darkness, watching, judging. Greta pulled the meat from her pocket. It was cold now, the fat congealed to white around the edges. She lifted it to her mouth, and the taste exploded across her tongue. Savory, rich, real, not poison, not theater, just food. And suddenly, without warning, she was crying. Great, silent sobs that shook her whole body, tears streaming down her face as she chewed that cold piece of American beef in the darkness. Because if this was real, if they were actually feeding her the same food as their own soldiers, then what else had been real? Her grandmother's warnings? The newspaper stories about American atrocities? The absolute certainty that they were fighting for survival against an existential evil? The propaganda machine is a terrible thing. Not because it makes you believe lies, that's bad enough, but because once you realize you've been lied to about one fundamental thing, the ground falls away beneath everything else. You start to question, and once you start, you can't stop. By morning, Greta had made a decision. A small one, but revolutionary in its way. She would pay attention. She would watch. She would collect evidence with the same methodical precision she'd once used to relay radio coordinates. And she would figure out which world was real. The one she'd been taught, or the one currently serving her breakfast. By the end of the first week, Greta had earned $3.60. She held the camp script in her palm like archaeological artifacts from a civilization she didn't understand. Thin paper vouchers printed with the Camp Florence seal, 45 cents per day for 8 hours of laundry duty, hauling wet uniforms from industrial washers to clotheslines that stretched across the compound. The work wasn't hard. The water was hot, turning her hands pink. The other prisoners, mostly men who'd been here for months, worked alongside them with an efficiency that spoke of routine, not desperation. On Saturday, Greta walked to the camp canteen with Anna Schultz. Her hands trembled as she selected items from the shelves. Toothpaste, real Colgate in a metal tube, writing paper, a pencil, a bar of chocolate that cost 20 cents. The clerk, a bored corporal who barely looked up from his magazine, took her scrip and waved her along. Just like that. No humiliation, no games. A transaction as mundane as buying groceries in Munich before the war. "I don't understand," Anna whispered as they walked back to the barracks, clutching their purchases like religious relics. "Why are they paying us? Why do they let us buy things? We're prisoners." "I don't know," Greta admitted. But she was starting to form a theory, and it was more disturbing than any torture could have been. Now let me introduce you to someone real. His name was Don Young, and he was 19 years old when he started working at Camp Florence in 1944. Farm kid from rural Arizona, drafted into a war he barely understood, assigned to guard Germans who, in his imagination, were probably goose-stepping fanatics plotting escape and sabotage. What he found instead were men, just men. Decades later, Young would sit down with historians from the Arizona Historical Society and recall those days with a mixture of bewilderment and fondness that time had allowed. There were two types, he remembered, leaning back in his chair, hands folded. The draftees who had no enthusiasm for the war, and the hardcore believers. But even the hardcore ones, once they'd been here a few months, once they realized nobody was going to shoot them or starve them, even they started to relax. Young worked in the motor pool, maintaining the trucks that transported prisoners to work details. Cotton fields mostly. Arizona had a labor shortage. Millions of American men were overseas, and the Geneva Convention allowed POWs to be put to work for the detaining power. 50 cents an hour. The Germans loved it. They'd bet each other, Young remembered, still bemused decades later. Bet on who could pick the most cotton. Turned it into a competition. Made a game out of it. Some of these guys were picking more in a day than our regular farm hands. Think about that for a moment. German prisoners of war in the Arizona desert, competing to see who could pick cotton faster, making wages they'd never seen in Germany, saving money to send home or spend at the canteen. The cognitive dissonance must have been extraordinary. But here's what Young remembered most clearly, and you could hear the wonder still in his voice when he spoke about it. They built us a bar for the officers' club, made it out of cactus, gathered the wood themselves, shaped it, sanded it smooth. Beautiful piece of work. They didn't have to do that. Nobody asked them to. But they did it anyway. Why? Young understood, even if he couldn't quite articulate it at the time. Humans need purpose, need to create, need to contribute. Even in captivity, especially in captivity. We search for ways to prove we're more than just bodies occupying space. The Germans built a cactus bar because it let them be craftsmen instead of prisoners. Because it gave them pride in something beyond survival. And the Americans let them do it because, whether they consciously realized it or not, they understood something fundamental about dignity, about treating people like people, even when those people wore the uniform of your enemy. Greta watched Lieutenant Sarah Tanaka constantly now, studied her the way you'd study a locked door, searching for the mechanism that would explain how it opened. Sarah moved through the camp with mechanical efficiency, clipboard always in hand, enforcing rules with the same flat consistency whether the violation was minor or serious. No raised voices, no favoritism, no visible emotion. When a guard tried to skip a prisoner's dessert ration as a joke, just a harmless prank, really, teaching the Krauts a lesson, Sarah reassigned him to night watch for a month, logged it in triplicate. No anger, no lecture, just consequences applied with bureaucratic precision. When Liesel Weber hoarded bread in her footlocker, 12 rolls, hidden under spare clothing like treasures from a dragon's hoard, Sarah confiscated them without comment. logged that too, marked it in Liesel's file with the same mechanical efficiency she brought to everything. What Greta couldn't understand was the restraint, because Sarah had every reason to hate them. The whispers traveled through the camp like water through cracks, seeping into every conversation, every quiet moment. Sarah's parents had been imprisoned in Manzanar, one of the internment camps in California. Not POWs. They were American citizens, loyal Americans who'd run a grocery store in San Francisco for 30 years. But their crime was having Japanese ancestry when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. 120,000 people, 2/3 of them American-born, swept up and imprisoned without trial because of how they looked. Everything Sarah's parents had built, 3 decades of work, of community ties, of proving themselves as Americans, gone in a week, sold for pennies on the dollar or simply taken. Their store, their home, their lives dismantled by Executive Order 9066 and Sarah's brother. Her older brother who'd enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor, desperate to prove the family's loyalty, to show that they were real Americans. He died at Anzio, leading his platoon up a hill they'd been ordered to take. Died with a bullet in his chest, and a flag on his coffin, and a posthumous medal his parents received in an internment camp behind barbed wire. Yet here, Sarah stood, treating enemy women with a care that felt more disturbing than cruelty ever could. Greta couldn't reconcile it, couldn't understand how someone with that much justified rage could enforce rules with such scrupulous fairness. One evening, Sarah found Greta sitting alone in the barracks, staring at a blank piece of writing paper. The others had gone to the recreation hall for a film screening. Some American comedy Greta couldn't imagine finding funny. But she couldn't make herself move, couldn't make herself do anything but sit with the pencil hovering over the page. "Writer's block?" Sarah asked in German, her accent precise and oddly formal, each word carefully shaped. Greta looked up, startled. "I don't know what to say to my family. If they're even—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't give voice to the fear that had been growing in her chest, like ice. The truth is usually a good start. "The truth is, I'm being treated better here than I ever was at home." The words came out sharp, almost angry. "The truth is, I eat steak while they starve. The truth is, I sleep in a bed while they hide in bombed-out buildings. How do I write that? How do I tell them I'm grateful to my captors?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small cloth-bound book, German-English dictionary. The cover worn soft at the edges from years of use. She set it on the bunk beside Greta with careful deliberation. "I thought you might want to read the convention yourself," Sarah said. "Article by article. It's not mercy. It's law. There's a difference." Greta picked up the dictionary slowly, feeling the weight of it in her hands. The pages were dog-eared, margins filled with penciled notes in tiny handwriting. This was Sarah's personal copy, worn smooth by countless consultations. "Why are you doing this?" Greta asked. "Doing what?" "Treating us like we're human." Something shifted behind Sarah's eyes. Not quite emotion. She was too controlled for that. But something. A crack in the mechanical facade, quickly smoothed over but visible for just a moment. "Because the law says you are," Sarah replied, her voice flat again, professional. "And the minute I stop following the law, I become what I'm fighting against. My brother died believing America was better than that. I owe it to him to prove he was right." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. Her back still to Greta, she added quietly, "Your family would want to know you're alive. Write that first. Everything else can wait." After Sarah left, Greta opened the dictionary. The pages smelled like ink and old paper and something else. Maybe hope, maybe desperation. She started with basics. "Hello? Thank you. Please." Words that felt like bridges between worlds. But she found herself drawn to other words. Restraint. Justice. Mercy. Law. She sounded them out quietly, testing the shapes in her mouth, feeling how the English syllables moved differently than German ones. By the end of the second week, she'd begun teaching English to the younger prisoners in exchange for their dessert rations. Anna was her best student, absorbing vocabulary with frightening speed, repeating phrases until they sounded almost native. Even Liesel showed up once, standing at the back of the barracks with her arms crossed, listening but never participating, never acknowledging what she was learning. "Why are you learning their language?" Liesel demanded one night, her voice cutting through the darkness after lights out like a blade. "Why are you collaborating with them?" Greta didn't answer right away. She thought about the dictionary with its worn pages, about Sarah's mechanical kindness that somehow hurt more than cruelty, about the steak that had tasted like treason and truth in equal measure. "Because I want to understand what they're saying," she finally replied into the darkness, "when they tell us why." "There is no why," Liesel shot back, her voice hard. "There's only them and us, enemy and prisoner. There's only waiting until we can go home." But Greta wasn't sure anymore what home even meant, or if there was anything left to go back to. Let me tell you about another real prisoner now, because his story illustrates something profound about the arbitrary nature of fate and how history moves people around like chess pieces with no regard for their actual allegiances. His name was Hans Kremer. In 1932, at age 23, Hans emigrated from Germany to Cleveland, Ohio. He worked in a factory making electrical components, learned English in night classes, saved money meticulously, planning to bring his parents over once he was established. For 7 years, he lived the American dream, or at least an immigrant's version of it. In 1939, he decided to visit his parents first, just a quick trip to see the old country, show them how well he'd done, then come back to America and start the immigration process. He arrived in Germany in August 1939. 2 weeks later, Germany invaded Poland. The borders closed. Hans tried everything to get back to Cleveland. Bribed officials, contacted the American embassy, pleaded his case to anyone who would listen. It didn't matter. He was German by birth, and Germany was at war. Hans was drafted immediately, sent to the Eastern Front, where the cold was worse than anything Ohio had ever produced. Survived 3 years of horror before being captured by Americans in France in 1944, and somehow, through the cosmic joke of timing and circumstance, ended up back in an American prison camp, speaking English with a Cleveland accent, asking guards if they remembered when cigarettes cost 13 cents. Guard AE. Bud. Gomez would tell this story for the rest of his life, always with the same sense of wonder at the absurdity. Late one night, a new transport of prisoners arrived. Gomes, on duty at the gate, asked the standard question, "Does anyone speak English?" One prisoner stepped forward. Young guy, maybe 30, wearing a German uniform but moving with a confidence that seemed wrong somehow. "Do you mind if I have a cigarette?" The man asked in perfect American English, no accent, no hesitation. Gomez, surprised, said no, handed him one. The German lit it, with hands that shook slightly, inhaled deeply like a man who'd been waiting for this moment, and said, "Remember when you could get a pack of these for 13 cents? Gomes stared at him. "Yes, I do. But how the hell do you know about that?" "I lived in Cleveland for 7 years, Hans replied, smoke curling from his lips. "Worked at Thompson Electric. Had an apartment on Euclid Avenue. Got stuck in Germany when the war started. Been trying to get back ever since." There's something almost unbearably sad about that story when you really think about it. Hans Kremer didn't want to fight, didn't believe in the ideology, didn't care about Hitler's vision or the 1,000-year Reich. He just wanted to go back to his factory job in Cleveland, to his apartment on Euclid Avenue, to the life he'd been building in America. Instead, he spent years fighting for a country he'd left behind, against a country he'd chosen, until fate dropped him in a prison camp in Arizona where his captors spoke the same language he'd used at the grocery store, where he could discuss American prices and complain about rationing like he'd never left. The war reduced humans to chess pieces, moved them around the board according to rules that had nothing to do with their actual allegiances or desires. Hans was one of the lucky ones. He survived, made it back to Cleveland after the war, resumed his life as if nothing had happened. But how many others weren't so fortunate? How many Hans Creamers died in the mud of Normandy or the snow of Stalingrad, fighting for causes they didn't believe in because they'd had the misfortune of being in the wrong place when history decided to explode? 3 months passed like water through fingers. Greta learned to sleep without startling awake at every sound. Learned to eat without checking the food first, without waiting for someone else to take the first bite. Learned the English words for sunrise and coffee, and good morning, and how to say them to Jimmy Mueller, the camp mess sergeant, when he handed her breakfast with that same gentle smile. Mueller was a large man, maybe 45, with hands like shovels, and a face that looked like it had been designed by a committee trying to create the concept of friendly. He spoke almost no German, but had learned a few key phrases. Guten Morgen. Bitte schön. Danke. He mangled the pronunciation, but delivered them with such genuine warmth that it didn't matter. She learned the rhythms of the camp. The 6 a.m. wake-up call that came too early, but was never cruel. The work details that provided structure and purpose. The mail call at 3 p.m. that brought hope and despair in equal measure. Letters from home for some. Nothing but silence for others. The evening recreation, where prisoners watched American films and tried to understand the culture that had captured them. The camp settled into routine. And routine, Greta discovered, was its own kind of prison. Because once you're no longer fighting for survival every moment, you have time to think. And thinking, real thinking, the kind that questions everything you've ever been taught, is dangerous. One afternoon, working in the laundry with arms deep in hot, soapy water, Greta found herself next to Friedrich Riedel, mid-30s, Wehrmacht officer, captured in North Africa during Rommel's retreat. He'd been at Florence for almost a year, long enough that his English was nearly fluent, long enough that he moved through the camp with the ease of someone who knew all the rules and rhythms. "You're learning English," he observed in German, nodding at the vocabulary notebook sticking out of her pocket, pages curled from humidity and use. "Yes. Smart. It's a good language. Practical." He was quiet for a moment, hands working mechanically through the wet uniforms, then added, "You know what I miss most? Not Germany. Not even my family. God forgive me for saying it. What I miss is certainty." Greta looked at him sharply, water dripping from her raised hands. "Here," Friedrich continued, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I don't have to wonder if the officer giving orders is competent or just a political appointment who'll get us all killed. I don't have to worry about whether the supply line will hold or if we'll starve because someone higher up decided another unit was more important. I don't have to question whether the mission makes sense or if we're being sacrificed for propaganda. Someone tells me to do laundry, I do laundry. Someone gives me food, I eat food. It's," he struggled for the word, "simple, clear." "You're saying you prefer being a prisoner." "I'm saying I prefer knowing the rules and having them applied fairly," he corrected. He smiled then, a sad, complicated expression that contained years of disillusionment. In Germany, everything was about who you knew, what party member liked you, whether your commanding officer was in a good mood. Resources went to whoever had the best connections, not who needed them most. Here, the rules are the rules. Lieutenant Tanaka enforces them the same for everyone. There's something almost restful about that, about knowing that if I follow the rules, I'll be treated fairly. That's more freedom than I had in uniform. Later, Greta would remember that conversation with perfect clarity. Remember Friedrich's admission that he felt freer as a prisoner under American law than as a citizen under German authority. It was the most damning indictment of the Reich she'd ever heard. And it came from a loyal Wehrmacht officer who'd fought for 3 years, who'd believed in duty and honor and serving his country. The architecture of restraint, Greta was learning, wasn't about weakness. It was about building systems that applied rules fairly, that treated humans as humans rather than as problems to be solved with violence. It was about choosing law over vengeance, even when vengeance felt righteous, especially when vengeance felt righteous. 3 months and 2 weeks after Greta arrived at Camp Florence, Lieutenant Sarah Tanaka gathered all the women and marched them to the camp theater without explanation. No advance notice, no preparation, just a curt command to follow. The room was small and close, air thick with Arizona heat, even though the sun was setting. Folding chairs arranged in rows facing a white screen stretched across the far wall. A projector sat in the back, already threaded and humming with mechanical anticipation. Sarah stood at the front, her face carved from stone, more rigid than Greta had ever seen it. Something was different. Something had shifted in the lieutenant's carefully maintained composure. "VE Day was 2 weeks ago," she said in German, her voice carrying no inflection whatsoever, each word dropping like a stone into still water. "The war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered. What you're about to see are newsreels from the Allied liberation of concentration camps. You will watch all of it. There will be no leaving early." Greta's stomach dropped. Beside her, Anna had gone white as paper, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair so hard her knuckles showed bone white through the skin. The lights dimmed. The projector clicked to life with that distinctive mechanical chatter. Bergen-Belsen appeared first. Mountains of skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood, limbs twisted at impossible angles, faces frozen in expressions that suggested death had not been gentle. Living prisoners who looked like animated corpses, hollow-eyed and swaying, barely strong enough to stand, barely strong enough to be called alive. British soldiers wearing masks against the stench, using bulldozers to push the dead into mass graves because there were too many to bury any other way, too many to process individually, too many to treat like humans even in death. The narration continued in English, but Greta didn't need translation. The images spoke a universal language of horror. Then Dachau, then Buchenwald, then Auschwitz. The projector showed everything. The gas chambers disguised as showers, tile walls that promised cleanliness and delivered death. The ovens, brick structures designed with industrial efficiency. The medical experimentation rooms with their tables and instruments that looked like they belonged in hospitals but had been used for things that had no name in civilized language. The warehouses full of human hair, baled like cotton, sorted by color and texture for industrial use. Mountains of shoes, children's shoes, women's shoes, men's shoes, each pair representing a person who'd walked into those camps and never walked out. Eyeglasses, wedding rings, suitcases labeled with names and addresses of people who'd been told they were being relocated, who'd carefully packed their belongings for a journey they'd never complete. The piles of children's toys. That's what broke Greta. Not the bodies, not the ovens, not the gas chambers. The toys, small wooden dolls, a teddy bear, a ball, items that represented childhood, innocence, futures that had been erased with industrial efficiency. She made it through 15 minutes before she stumbled up the aisle, hand clamped over her mouth, barely seeing where she was going. She burst through the side door and barely made it to the edge of the building before her stomach emptied violently onto the desert sand. She retched until there was nothing left, then kept retching, her body trying to expel something that couldn't be vomited away, trying to purge knowledge that had already burrowed into her brain, images that would live there forever. The worst part wasn't the images themselves, though God knows they were bad enough to haunt anyone for a lifetime. The worst part was the efficiency. the paperwork visible in some shots. The neat German organization that had turned mass murder into an administrative process, complete with forms and files and schedules. The camps hadn't been chaotic outbursts of violence. They'd been planned, systematized, made efficient. That was somehow worse than random cruelty could ever be. She didn't hear Sarah approach. Didn't know she was there until the lieutenant's shadow fell across the ground beside her, a dark shape against the fading desert light. "Did you know?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice stripped of its usual mechanical quality, raw in a way Greta had never heard. Greta wiped her mouth with shaking hands that wouldn't stop trembling. "No," her voice came out barely recognizable, scraped raw. "I didn't. We didn't. I never saw anything like that. I was just a radio operator. I just relayed messages and coordinates and—" She stopped because the excuse died in her throat, tasting like ash. But I should have asked, she thought. I should have wondered why they needed so many trains, so many camps. Why the radio traffic spoke in code about special treatment and relocation and final solutions. I should have questioned where all those people were going. I should have, she started, then stopped again. Should have what? Asked questions? Looked harder? Refused to relay the messages? The words felt pathetic even as she spoke them. What could one radio operator have done? What difference would her single refusal have made? They would have found someone else to send the messages, someone else to coordinate the trains. But she'd never even tried, had never even questioned, had simply done her job and gone home and slept soundly, never wondering about the human cost of the coordinates she transmitted. Sarah was silent for a long time, standing there in the growing darkness while Greta hunched over, arms wrapped around herself like she could hold her own body together through sheer force of will. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice had lost its mechanical edge, become something more vulnerable, more human than Greta had ever heard from her. My parents lost their grocery store in San Francisco, she said, the words careful, measured, like each one cost something to speak. Everything they'd built in 30 years. The store my father opened when he was barely 20. The relationships they'd cultivated with customers who'd known them for decades. The apartment upstairs where I grew up, gone in a week when Roosevelt signed that order. She looked up at the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, countless points of light indifferent to human suffering. They got sent to Manzanar, tar paper barracks in the desert, armed guards, barbed wire. My mother, who'd been a U.S. citizen for 20 years. My father, who'd fought in World War I, who had a Purple Heart in a box in his closet. Didn't matter. They looked like the enemy. So they were the enemy. She paused, swallowed hard, her throat working visibly. My brother Michael enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. Didn't wait for the draft. Signed up immediately because he wanted to prove we were loyal, to show we were real Americans, not traitors just because of our ancestry. He died at Anzio, leading his platoon up a hill they'd been ordered to take. They sent his Purple Heart to my parents in the internment camp, had it delivered behind barbed wire. Greta couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could barely process what she was hearing. I wanted to hate every single one of you, Sarah continued, her voice flat again but threaded with something raw beneath the surface. Every morning I wake up and I have to force myself to remember that you're human, that the law says you get the same food I eat, the same medical care, the same basic dignity. Some days it's easy. Some days I stand in front of the mess hall and watch you eat steak, and I want to throw your trays on the ground and tell you what my parents are eating in Manzanar. She turned finally to look at Greta, and in the fading light her eyes were dark pools of controlled pain. Restraint isn't kindness, Sarah said. It's not mercy. It's not about being nice or fair or good. It's the only thing standing between civilization and that. She gestured back toward the theater, where the projector was still running, still showing horrors that would define a generation. The minute I start deciding who deserves humanity and who doesn't, The minute I start making exceptions based on what I think is justified, I become no different from the people who built those camps." She stood there for another moment, then added quietly, "You didn't build Auschwitz. You didn't run Bergen-Belsen. You didn't pull the levers on the gas chambers. But you were part of a system that made them possible. You transmitted the messages. You followed the orders. You never asked where the trains were going. And now you have to decide what you're going to do with that knowledge." She walked away, footsteps crunching on gravel, leaving Greta alone in the darkness, with the stars and the taste of bile and knowledge that couldn't be unknown. Greta stayed there until full dark swallowed everything, sitting in the sand, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of complicity settle onto her shoulders like a physical burden she'd carry for the rest of her life. 3 days later, the Red Cross envelope arrived. Greta was at the laundry when Anna found her, face pale, holding the thin envelope like it might explode. The Red Cross logo was instantly recognizable, that symbol that should have meant hope, but so often delivered the opposite. "It came for you," Anna said, her voice small. I thought you'd want it right away." Greta dried her hands slowly on her work apron, each movement deliberate, delaying the moment when she'd have to open it and learn what she already suspected. She held the envelope between her fingers in the harsh Arizona sunlight, feeling the weight of absence inside it. Red Cross letterhead, official stamps, too thin to contain good news. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking as she tore it open. The paper ripped unevenly, her fingers clumsy with dread. The words swam on the page, German typed on an American typewriter, some letters slightly off-kilter where the typist had struggled with the unfamiliar characters. She had to read the message 3 times before the meaning penetrated through the fog of denial her brain was desperately constructing. Her mother, Greta Hoffman, age 47, and her younger brother Klaus, age 15, confirmed dead, killed in the February firebombing of Dresden. The Red Cross had traced them through surviving records to an address that no longer existed, in a neighborhood that had been erased from the map. No remains recovered, no burial site, just gone, vaporized in the firestorm that had consumed the city. Her father, Wilhelm Hoffman, age 51, missing, last seen in the chaos of the Soviet advance through eastern Germany in April. Presumed dead, though no confirmation could be obtained. The trail ended at a displaced persons camp where someone thought they remembered a man matching his description. But the records had been lost or destroyed, and no one could say for certain. Her grandmother, the woman who'd gripped her face at the Munich railway station and told her to die with honor, found hanged in the garden shed of their family home 2 days after the surrender. A neighbor had discovered the body. She'd left no note. The house itself had been commandeered by Allied forces and was currently serving as temporary housing for refugees. Greta folded the letter with mechanical precision, her hands moving on autopilot while her brain struggled to process. She creased the edges sharp and neat, making perfect corners like the geometry mattered, like precise folds could somehow contain the information, make it manageable. She placed it in her footlocker beneath the German-English dictionary, between her work shirts and spare underwear. Then she lay down on her bunk in the middle of the afternoon, in the middle of a work shift, and stared at the ceiling, feeling absolutely nothing. The absence of feeling was so complete, it was almost peaceful. No tears, no screaming, just a vast emptiness where emotions should have been. The nothing lasted 3 days. She stopped eating. The food on her tray, still generous, still hot, still the same as the guards ate, looked obscene, offensive. While her mother had burned alive in Dresden's firestorm, while the heat had been so intense it had created winds strong enough to pull people off their feet and into the flames, Greta had been gaining weight on American beef. While her 15-year-old brother had starved in the rubble, had probably died scared and alone calling for their mother, Greta had been sleeping on a mattress with sheets that were changed weekly and blankets that kept out the desert. cold, while her grandmother, that fierce old woman who'd survived one war and couldn't bear to see her country destroyed by another, had climbed onto a chair in the garden shed and fashioned a noose from clothesline. Greta had been learning English, had been laughing at her own mistakes, had been singing folk songs with the enemy. How could she eat? How could she sleep? How could she continue existing while they were gone? Jimmy Muller noticed first. The mess sergeant had a memory for faces and appetites, kept track of who was eating and who wasn't with the attention of someone who took his job seriously. He approached her table at dinner on the third day, concern creasing his broad, friendly face. "You need to eat something." "Miss, please." His German was terrible, the words mangled almost beyond recognition. But the worry was clear. She stared at the steak on her plate. It might as well have been made of ash and guilt. She pushed the tray away without speaking, without even acknowledging his presence. That night, Liesl cornered her in the barracks. The older woman had been watching Greta's descent with something that looked almost like satisfaction. Now she materialized beside Greta's bunk, like a dark oracle who'd been waiting to deliver an uncomfortable truth. Her face was hard as flint, eyes blazing with something between fury and vindication, and perhaps a twisted kind of concern. "I told you," she hissed in rapid German, her voice low enough not to carry to the other bunks, but sharp enough to cut. "I told you they were playing games. Now you see it, don't you? Now you understand." Greta said nothing, didn't even turn her head to look at Liesl. "They fed you while your family died," Liesl continued, relentless. "They made you comfortable while Germany burned. They gave you soap and chocolate and English lessons while your grandmother chose death over dishonor. They turned you into a traitor without you even realizing it." "I never," Greta started, but her voice wouldn't work properly. Came out like gravel and broken glass. "You befriended her, that Japanese woman. You learned their language like a good little student. You laughed at their piano playing. You sang their songs." Liesl's voice rose sharp enough to cut, loud enough now that heads were turning on other bunks. "You chose them over your own people, over your own blood. Your grandmother knew what was coming. That's why she did what she did. She couldn't bear to see what you'd become." "That's not—" Greta tried again. "You're a collaborator," Liesl spat, her voice dripping with contempt. "A disgrace. Your grandmother killed herself because she knew what honor looked like. She understood that death was better than this, better than becoming what you've become." Liesl leaned closer, her breath hot on Greta's face. "And you? You lying there in your clean American bed, wearing your clean American clothes, eating your clean American food, while your family moldered in unmarked graves? You make me sick." Something broke loose inside Greta's chest. Something that had been holding itself together through sheer force of will suddenly snapped like a wire under too much tension. She launched herself at Liesl, fists swinging wildly, not trained, not controlled, just pure animal rage, looking for a target. They crashed into the bunk frame, tangled together. Greta felt her knuckles connect with something soft, heard Liesl grunt, felt hands grabbing at her hair. Anna and two others trying to pull them apart, shouting, but Greta barely heard them. She was screaming words that didn't form sentences, wasn't even sure what language she was using. She wanted to hurt something, wanted to make the world hurt the way she hurt, wanted to take all the pain and guilt and survivor's shame and pour it into her fists and make it Liesl's problem instead of hers. She felt a fist connect with her jaw, sharp and solid. Tasted copper. Didn't care. Welcomed it even. Pain was better than the nothing. Rage was better than emptiness. Guards flooded the barracks within seconds. They must have been close, must have heard the commotion. Strong hands dragged her away from Liesl, pulled her backwards, even as she kept trying to reach the older woman, kept trying to hurt something. Anything. She was still screaming when they lifted her bodily off the floor, still fighting when they carried her out of the barracks and across the compound. still making incoherent sounds of rage and grief when they opened the isolation cell door and placed her inside with surprising gentleness. The door closed, locked, and suddenly the screaming stopped. Silence pressed down like a physical weight, like the entire atmosphere had become solid and was crushing her into the concrete floor. The isolation cell was small, maybe 8 feet by 10, a cot bolted to the wall, a bucket in the corner, a single small window high up near the ceiling, too high to reach, too small to fit through even if she could. Bare concrete walls, a door with a slot for food trays. Nothing else. For 3 days, Greta sat in that cell and faced the question she'd been running from since the newsreels, since the letter, since the first bite of steak 3 months ago that had tasted like treason. Did being treated with mercy make her complicit in her family's deaths? Did surviving while they died mean she'd betrayed them? Was gratitude the same as treason? Could you accept kindness from your captors without becoming a traitor to your own people? The cell had one small window, high up near the ceiling where she couldn't reach it even standing on the cot. At night, she could see stars through it. The same stars that had looked down on Dresden when it burned. The same stars that had watched her grandmother tie the rope. The same stars that were shining over her mother and brother's unmarked grave. If they even had a grave. If there was anything left to bury. The stars were indifferent and eternal. They'd seen civilizations rise and fall. They'd watched humans slaughter each other for 10,000 years. They would continue shining long after everyone who remembered World War II. World War II was dead. There was something almost comforting in that indifference, in knowing that the cosmos didn't care about her guilt or her grief, or her impossible moral calculations. On the 3rd day, Sarah came to the cell door. She didn't unlock it, just sat on the floor outside, back against the bars, close enough that Greta could hear her breathing, but far enough that it didn't feel like an interrogation. She sat there for maybe 5 minutes without speaking, just sitting, sharing the silence. Then she spoke through the gap between door and frame, her voice quiet in a way Greta had never heard from her. "I got the report about your family," Sarah said. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't help. I know sorry doesn't bring them back or make any of this make sense. But I am sorry." Greta said nothing. Lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, tracking a crack that ran from corner to corner like a lightning bolt frozen in concrete. "You didn't kill them," Sarah continued after a pause. "You didn't drop the bombs on Dresden or start the war or vote for any of the policies that led to this. You were 22 years old and following orders because that's what you were taught to do. That's what everyone was taught to do." "I should have been there." Greta's voice cracked, words scraping out of her throat like shards of glass. "To die with them. To burn with my mother. To starve with my brother. To hang with my grandmother. Would that have made it better? It would have been honest." The words came out bitter, poisoned. "Instead, I'm here. Safe, fed, alive, learning English and eating steak and singing songs while they—" She couldn't finish. Couldn't say the words out loud because saying them would make them more real somehow. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Greta could hear her breathing, slow and measured, like she was choosing her next words carefully. "You didn't choose to be captured," she finally said. "You didn't choose to be fed, or treated according to the convention, or given soap and clean clothes. But you can choose what to do with the fact that you survived." She shifted position. Greta could hear the fabric of her uniform rustling against the concrete floor. "People are going to need bridges," Sarah continued. "Between languages, between enemies, between the world that was and the world that's coming, between the people who did terrible things and the people who suffered from them. Someone has to help rebuild. Someone has to translate not just words, but understanding. You can be that bridge, or you can let the guilt eat you alive until there's nothing left." She paused. But either way, your family is still gone. And you're still here. What you do with that, that's the only choice you actually have. Everything else is already decided. She stood up. Greta could hear her brushing dust from her uniform, hear her footsteps starting to move away. Your grandmother chose death, Sarah said from the doorway, her voice fading as she walked away. You can honor that choice by choosing life, by making sure her death meant something. Or you can follow her and make it all meaningless. Up to you. The footsteps faded down the corridor, leaving Greta alone with the silence and the stars and the impossible weight of survival. She curled up on the thin mattress and finally let herself cry. Not the silent tears she'd shed before, not the restrained grief of someone trying to maintain control. These were great wrenching sobs that tore through her chest and left her gasping for air, that shook her whole body, that felt like they might actually tear her apart from the inside. She cried until she was empty, until there was nothing left but the terrible, unbearable fact of her own continued existence, until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen, and she had no more tears left to shed. And then, in that emptiness, in that space where grief had burned everything else away, a small cold thought crystallized. Sarah was right. She couldn't bring them back, couldn't change what had happened, couldn't rewind time and make different choices. The only choice she had was what to do next, how to carry this forward, whether to let it destroy her or forge it into something useful. Her grandmother had chosen death because she couldn't imagine a world where Germany lost, couldn't imagine surviving in the ruins of everything she'd believed in. But Greta was already living in those ruins, already surviving in a world where every certainty had been revealed as a lie. The question was whether that survival would mean anything, whether she could take the mercy she'd been shown, the mercy she didn't deserve, the mercy that felt like betrayal, and somehow transform it into something that honored the dead instead of insulting them. She didn't have an answer yet, but she had 3 more days in isolation to think about it. They released Greta on a Wednesday morning. The door opened without ceremony, no explanation offered, and she walked out into Arizona sunshine that felt too bright, too clean, too innocent for what she carried inside. She made her way back to the barracks with her jaw still tender from Liesel's fist, her hands still shaking from 3 days of barely eating, her eyes still raw from crying. The other women were preparing for repatriation. The camp was processing them in waves, sending them back to occupied Germany on transport ships that would dock in Hamburg, or Bremen, or whatever ports the Allies controlled now. Most of the women were terrified. You could see it in their faces, hear it in their hushed conversations when they thought the guards weren't listening. Anna sat on her bunk, clutching a single photograph of her family home, now reduced to rubble according to the Red Cross report she'd received. The photo showed a neat house with flower boxes in the windows, taken in better times. She was crying quietly, tears running down her face without sound, her whole body shaking. "There's nothing to go back to," she whispered, when Greta sat down beside her. "No house, no family, no jobs. Just ruins and starvation and Russian soldiers doing God knows what. My sister wrote that they're living in a basement with 7 other families. 7 families in a space meant for storing potatoes." She looked up at Greta with red-rimmed eyes. "At least here we're human. At least here we have beds and food and nobody—" She stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Across the room, Liesel stood by the window with her arms crossed, staring out at the desert with an expression Greta couldn't read. The older woman had a black eye from their fight, swollen and purple, and she carried herself with a rigid dignity that suggested she was holding something together through sheer force of will. "We should have stayed prisoners," Liesel said to the window, to the desert, to no one in particular. "It's the only safe place left for us. The only place where the rules are clear and someone makes sure they're followed." Greta felt hollow, scooped out, like someone had taken everything inside her and replaced it with sand and emptiness. But she moved through the days mechanically, attended her work, assignments even though her hands shook and she had to stop frequently to catch her breath. Ate small amounts because Sarah appeared at every meal and watched her until she took at least a few bites, until she proved she was trying. A week after her release from isolation, Sarah found her in the laundry room, standing over a basin of soapy water, hands idle. Just staring at nothing, Sarah handed her an envelope. Standard Red Cross issue, addressed in shaky handwriting. "Red Cross needs a translator," Sarah said, her voice matter-of-fact, professional. German refugee in Tucson looking for her daughter. Lost track of her somewhere between Munich and the Swiss border in the chaos. "I told them you might help." Greta stared at the letter. The envelope was worn, had clearly passed through many hands. The handwriting was that of someone elderly or ill, letters trembling across the page. She opened it slowly and read the contents. A mother's desperate plea, full of specific details. The daughter's full name, birth date, physical description, the color of her coat, dark blue wool with brass buttons, a distinctive scar on her left hand from a kitchen accident when she was 7, the name of her school, her favorite foods, her habit of humming when she was nervous. The kind of details only a real mother would know. The kind of specificity that came from years of paying attention, of loving someone enough to notice everything about them. "I don't know how," Greta started, her voice uncertain. "I don't know the systems. I don't know how to—" "You read German," Sarah interrupted. "You read English. You understand how bureaucracies work now. You've been living in one for 3 months. You know what it's like to wait for news about family. You know what these questions mean to people." She paused, watching Greta carefully. "It's not redemption. Nothing you do will bring your family back or erase what Germany did. But it's something real, something that matters to someone." Greta took the letter, held it carefully, feeling the weight of someone else's desperation and hope. That evening, she spent 3 hours carefully translating it into English, adding notes about where to search based on what she'd learned about displaced persons camps and Red Cross procedures, which agencies to contact, what paperwork would be needed, what questions to ask. She wrote a cover letter explaining the case, making it clear what was known and what wasn't, giving the searchers the best possible chance of success. She walked it back to Sarah's office after lights out, slid it under the door, and went back to her bunk, feeling something she couldn't quite name. Not hope, that was too strong. Not redemption, that was too grand. Just purpose. A sense that she'd done something useful, something that might actually help someone. 2 days later, another letter arrived. Then another the day after that. Word had spread somehow through the refugee networks, through Red Cross offices, through displaced persons camps. There was a German prisoner at Camp Florence who could help with missing persons cases, who understood both languages fluently, who could navigate the bureaucratic maze that separated families torn apart by war, who would take the time to do it carefully, thoroughly, to give each case the attention it deserved. The letters came in slowly at first, then in increasing numbers. A daughter looking for parents who disappeared in the chaos of the Soviet advance. A father searching for his son, last seen in Berlin. An entire family trying to locate a grandfather who'd been conscripted at age 62 in the final desperate days of the war, when Germany was drafting anyone who could hold a rifle. Greta translated requests, wrote letters, filled out forms in triplicate because that's what bureaucracies required. Small acts that felt inadequate against the ocean of suffering. Drops of water against a desert that stretched to every horizon. But real nonetheless. Some searches ended well. Most didn't. The mathematics of war were brutal and simple. More people were dead than alive. More families were destroyed than reunited. More questions would never be answered than resolved. Greta learned to manage her face when she had to deliver bad news, learned the German and English phrases for "we found," "remains," and "no records exist after this date," and "presumed deceased." Learned the subtle differences between missing and dead, and how much hope to allow people to carry without being cruel. She learned to sit with people while they grieved, either in person during camp visits or in spirit, while she wrote letters conveying information no one wanted to receive. Learned when to speak and when to stay silent. Learned that sometimes the most important thing she could do was simply witness their pain without trying to fix it or minimize it or rush them through it. But there were victories too, small ones, but they glowed like embers in darkness. A sister reunited with her brother after 18 months of not knowing if he was alive. The telegram came through marked urgent, and when Greta read it, she had to sit down, had to press her hand to her mouth to stop the sob that wanted to escape. A mother who found her daughter in a displaced persons camp near Stuttgart. The daughter had been working as a nurse, had assumed her mother was dead, had been going through the motions of survival without hope. The reunion letter made Greta cry. Happy tears this time. The first happy tears she'd shed since before the war. An elderly couple who'd been searching for each other, both convinced the other was dead, brought together by a Red Cross worker who cross-referenced their names across different databases and realized they were looking for each other from opposite sides of Germany. Those moments made the heartbreak bearable. Not easy, not pleasant, but bearable. 3 months into her work with the Red Cross cases, Greta received a letter herself. American postmark. Return address in Connecticut. She held it for a long moment before opening it, confused about who in America would be writing to her. The handwriting was neat, feminine, careful.